welcoming regardless. This is the third in our Sentience lecture series this fall. I'm glad you could make it. Really looking forward to it. This is titled Animating Artifacts with our guest speakers, David Garneau and Maureen Matthews. And to introduce them, we have Dr. David Howes, who is hosting this lecture series. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and co-director of the Center for Sensory Studies, also an adjunct professor at Faculty of Law at McGill University. Some of you already know him. Many of you love him. Here's David Howes.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I'd just like to begin by noting that Concordia University is situated on unceded Indigenous territories, that we are thankful for the opportunity to gather here today. Indigenous peoples have gathered numerous occasions in the past and continue to engage in conversation. And secondly, before I even introduce our guest today, I need to make two announcements regarding this, the Sentience virtual lecture series at Concordia University for the fall of 2021. One is that the presentation originally scheduled for the 12th of November at 11, namely Sensing Sentient Lands by Natasha Myers, has had to be cancelled due to illness, but we are looking forward to having Natasha join us in the winter. So please keep an eye out for notices that way. Secondly, Sensing Machines by Chris Salter, which is scheduled for 19th of November. The time of beginning of that presentation has been moved from 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock. So that will be clear from the posters and so forth, but just to heads up now. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce two scholars for whom I have infinite respect. Dr. Maureen Matthews is a graduate of the University of Oxford, where she defended a thesis on the attribution of animacy and agency to museum artifacts from a joint Ojibwa and anthropological theoretical perspective. In 2011, she joined the Manitoba Museum staff, and there she is the curator of cultural anthropology. And you will probably have heard Maureen over the airwaves in that she is a CBC radio documentary maker and has had a number of programs on ideas. They're a delight to listen to, and she's actually won 4 awards for her investigative journalism. So do check out her website to be able to follow up on those presentations. David Garneau is the acting head of the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Regina. He is Métis, born and raised in Edmonton. He is passionate about the visual arts, especially painting, but he also does work in performance, video, and public art. His art has been exhibited nationally and internationally at places such as the National Gallery of Canada, Canada House in London, and the National Symposium on Electronic Art, ICEA, most recently, as well as numerous public and private collections. He loves to travel, and in accord with that, he's actually been invited to give keynote talks in numerous places in Australia, New Zealand, the US, and throughout Canada. So we are delighted to have these two scholars with us today. And the topic of their conversation is animating artifacts. So we will begin with each of them making presentations, and then be able to follow their conversation for about a further 20 minutes. At that point, we will have a chance to join in the conversation and put questions to David and Maureen. So I look forward very much to their presentations, and let me therefore turn the floor over to Maureen to begin with.
Good morning, or is it good afternoon there in Montreal? Anyway, good morning, everybody. and I'm delighted to participate in this event. And I will start off. I'm not quite sure why I was chosen to go first, but I will start off with the work that I began as a journalist and finished up as an anthropologist. And there's a very definite trajectory there, which you will see as I go along. I've entitled this presentation Now in One Strum. It is the name of the book I produced after I finished my PhD. It was my thesis. And in this presentation, I can credit Roger Roulette equally with the work. They don't let you do that. For a thesis, you're supposed to say you did it all yourself. And of course, the anthropological method is ask someone who knows and write that down. So that is exactly what I did. Roger Roulette deserves a great deal of the credit. So I'll just begin there. And now here, I just have to make sure I figured out how to get. There we go. So I came to the very firm conviction that objects speak, that culture inheres in objects, that museum objects and Ojibwe culturally important and significant ceremonial objects make things happen in the world, not as a theorist, but as a journalist. And this picture is of the area where I began to work. And I began this work very innocently, a historian friend. So first of all, just Pauingassi is, I think, can you see my mouse? There's Pauingassi is the community that I've been working in. It is only.
We will need to share screen to begin with. I
oh
don't
golly! Oh, sorry.
Turning up. So to share screen and then access. Is that,
thank you.
Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's PowerPoint. Now, do you see that? Okay. Yeah. All right. So this is the map to which I was referring. Here is my mouse to which I was referring. Can you see that? Okay, good. Sorry, I think I was mad. Anyway, yeah. So there's a series of little communities in here. This is only 150 miles from Winnipeg, but it is for many historical reasons remarkably remote. And it is a place where people speak Ojibwe very fluently. I began going there in 1992, and at that point, I literally could not do anything without a translator because there was people simply didn't understand. I once almost bought a snowmobile by accident, just patting the hood and admiring it in my bad Ojibwe. So now the kids are somewhat fluent. But it is a remarkable place. You have to. So I just make sure I'm advancing the slides here. It is not always been off the map. It's these people have had a very long exposure to non-Indigenous people. This is a map from 1774, and this line of rivers here, where you go up the Severn and over the Height of Land and then down the Barons River, goes right past Pauingassi. And so it's been a place where they've had experience with non-Indigenous people for a very long time. So it's, that's, but nowadays, in order to get there, you have to fly. This is the kind of plane you have to fly because they don't even have an airstrip. You have to land on the water. And so this airplane is older than I am, but it still works and it's how you get there. It is achingly beautiful countryside. It's just gorgeous. And this is a part of Manitoba which has no dams, no mines, no industrial structures of any sort. It doesn't have any forestry. And it has recently been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I worked on that as well. And this is the community. It's built along the river. It's kind of one house wide and 4 miles long, about. It's not a big place. And these are some of the people. And I just wanted you to see that what the community is like, because it's important to the story. These are lovely, like these kids I had a really good time with, and I got to know them over the years quite well. And some of the elders I got to know really well. And I also was able to connect with them in many different ways, historically and also around craft these beautiful blankets and so on. So these are the people that I talked to when I was making my very first journalistic effort at in the area. And what had happened was that I talked to a friend named Jennifer Brown, who was a historian, and she had become very interested in the work of Irving Hallowell. This is Irving Hallowell here on the right, this fellow here. And this is Hallowell in Pauingassi. It was, you know, I was a journalist, and I had just made a show that went over reasonably well about stereotypes about Indigenous people. I called it at the time, this was 1990, you know, Anishinaabemowin, the white man's Indian. And it was about how non-Indigenous ideas about indigeneity just confound a relationship between First Nations and non-First Nations people. How they just make it almost impossible to have any kind of real connection. And my radio producer said to me, "Well, if you're so smart, why don't you make a show with no stereotype in it?" And I thought, "Oh, that's I don't know." And so I was talking to Jennifer, and she had a photograph of a dream drum, which may be the next slide. Yeah, no, this is a Pauingassi. Anyway, and I said, I wonder if we could find that drum. It was from a set of photographs that Hallowell had left behind that he had taken in the 1930s. So this is what Pauingassi looked like when Hallowell was there. And so eventually, in the course of finding this drum, I made my way back to Pauingassi, and I found there people who remembered the drum and remembered the story of Hallowell's visit. This is Hallowell sitting on the hill at Pauingassi. You recognize the outline of the rocks across the way. And Hallowell is a very important anthropologist. He made these Anishinaabe people famous. He was one of the sort of post Boasian anthropologists who were looking for the real Indians. But in doing so, he found Pauingassi and he found William Barons, and he had that sort of moment of anthropology where you just realize you're in a different country. And this photograph here is of some stones. In Hallowell's telling, Hallowell remembers seeing these very round stones and seeing that they had been given gifts. And he's by this time realized that in Ojibwe, stones are grammatically animate. So they have the identical grammatical treatment as a person. And he's formulating this idea of other than human persons. And he asks it's actually the fellow in the top right here, this fellow here, Kiwich. He says, well, if that stone is alive, are all stones alive? And the answer was no, but some are. And Hallowell is launched into an exploration of what's really meant by Ojibwe people when they say that a stone is an animate entity. And so that's, so I came at this idea from the people, because this is exactly how they were talking about it and talk about it to this day. This is a photograph of a stone that was brought to the Manitoba Museum about 8 years ago. And the person who brought it, who was from Pauingassi, said to me, "They move about, you know." And they said, "Don't expect to find it every time you look for it." And actually that has been true, but it's their most recent check, it was there. So this is one of those things which causes scientists, anthropologists to really get, you know, resist. They think, oh, they talk about it as myth. But Hallowell didn't. He said, well, what do they mean? What could they mean? And he used this was Namawan, the oldest man on the river at the time, and he talked to Namawan about these things. Hallowell went back to these communities 7 times over a period of 10 years and spent entire summers there. And so this is Namawan's son Angus, and Hallowell wrote about the Angus and others conducting a shake tent. And And again, you know, this is that moment. I talked to a student of Hallowell, and Hallowell was a scientist, and he believed science was going to explain everything. And then he would get to the point in his discussion about Anishinaabe religious practice, and he would talk about the shake tent. And he would tell about a time when one of the shake tent operators said, "You Hallowell out there, your father's been ill. He's been in the hospital, but by the time you get back, there'll be a letter and he's okay again now." And the student said, you know, a look crossed his face like, I'm going to tell you this and I cannot explain it. And that is the realm of this idea of objects that do things. So this is another picture of the same guy and his wife. And so when I went to Pauingassi, I met the grandson of Naamawin, and I was guided to him by the granddaughter of William Barrett. So they pointed out at one point that I must be the grandchild of Hallowell to be following up on this idea. Anyway, this is Omishush, Owen, and Margaret Simmons. And this is Roger Roulette, whom I mentioned earlier, who's helped me with all of the transcripts and translations, because all of these conversations happened in Ojibwe. I would go to visit these communities and I would not know what I had when I came home. Anyway, here's Omishush. You see the little microphone. He's looking at a photograph of himself as a, he might have been 22 or so, we think. Margaret, and he's recording the conversation about what these people are doing. This is the picture he's looking at. And here's Omishush as a young man. This is the Oshkabewis. This is the apprentices in the community. These are the people who were being trained in ceremony. And you'll see that they're holding objects. They have rattles. They have these sticks with the bear fur on them. And Omishush and his cousin here have bandoliers. These indicate that they are the, so in order to have these kind of ceremonies, including the Medeu and then the Wabano, which is what they were conducting at this point, they need all of the clans, and there weren't any Bear Clan people. So Omishush and his friend were honorary Bear Clan for the purposes of the ceremony. And they performed the role of kind of policing the area and not letting any dogs in, or no ruckus people or anything. So that was his job. And so that's Omishush as a young man. And here's a close-up of that image. I'm having so much trouble seeing this. There is the bandolier that he's wearing. So in the course of doing all this journalism, and I eventually did 8 programs about first the drum that Naamawin built, and then about thunderbirds, because you can't use drums without thunder, and then about a week ago I did one, and I did one about Mimagwesiwak. All of these are profoundly Ojibwe ideas that I brought to the radio through translation and explanation and so on. But the basic audio was all in Ojibwe. And in the course of doing all that, we discovered that the collection of regalia, which this group of young people are wearing, had been gathered up by an anthropologist in Winnipeg, and it was in a museum. So Charlie George came to this museum and talked about how wonderful it was, this collection. He saw his this is his bandolier here, very, very beautiful thing. And this is what he would have had underneath his shirt. It was made by his aunt, who's this lady right here. Miss Kwa'o is her name. And so here we are again. All of these, you see these rattles and so on. These things were all part of this collection. And the university didn't really realize it, so we put it together. It was just the most incredible wealth of information. It was, you just don't find collections of ceremonial objects that match a photograph of them actually in use and have hours and hours of explanation in Ojibwe about what was going on, how they were used, what it really meant to people. And so I just realized it was absolutely a goldmine of understanding, and that I too was on this same path as Hallowell, trying to come to understand what it meant that Shushigoan, that rattle there, is grammatically the same as somebody's grandma. And it's so this is a photograph of Namawin with his wife Kuwin, and there's some interesting things in this picture. One is this is a fairly overt statement of where Namawin's power came from, because this is a Thunderbird, and he quite openly allowed people to think that he had Thunderbird power. But of course, anybody who has a drum would have to have that. This is his water drum, and it is a very big water drum. It's maybe about 2 feet across, made from a really large tree, hollowed out. It is just a cylinder of a tree hollowed out and then covered beautifully. And again, this is in the museum. When Omashu saw this, he said, "Oh, look, there's the old man's pail." And and so anyway, here we have this group and all of the things that they're using as part of the ceremony. And here's one of the other interesting people. This is Jacob Owen, who I also interviewed for many hours. And so when I was interested in the Thunderbird aspect of things, oops, am I getting too late? Anyway, he explained the Thunderbird, and they said, if you're going to know something about thunder, you have to ask the guy with the feather. This is Jacob again. These are incredibly nice people, and I love Jacob. This is a quote from Omashush explaining that this is the Thunderbird was the reason they had drums. This is an example of the kind of audio that we have. So I have Roger has now nearly transcribed all of it. It's over 1,500 pages of word, single-spaced transcript and translation side by side. It is a monumental amount of work that Roger did. And so here we have the drum again. And there, that's it in the museum. It's a very powerful old drum. And this is exactly how people talk about the drum. It's not the drum as an alive thing becomes alive at a certain point in its being built. And actually, for very fluent speakers, there's 4 ways of talking about the drum. 3 of them are animate and 1 is not. And so there's one way of talking about it as animate, which you would really almost never use unless you were signaling to somebody else that you also practiced. And so Umashush did that to Roger. They both practiced. But so these are the words. So it's interesting because this is an object which clearly does things, but the grammatical animacy is not consistent. And actually, this was true of many of the things that we found. They were this is the dream drum he had. They quite often used a not grammatically animate thing as a way of directing people's attention away from some very important artifact. It wasn't, as it turned out, the grammatical animacy that was the key to sacredness, which is what museums would really like, is just to be able to know for sure. It was actually whether the object was playing that particular role at that time. And so for these sacred objects, the way that they talk about it is they become wikanak. They at a certain moment they are ritual brothers, and then they are always animate. They become something important. And actually, it's possible to talk about a person as not animate, and they did that about me. I thought I was, doing what I was supposed to do, and they were saying, "Oh, she's just doing what she's intended to do," and used a non-grammatical form for that. So anyway, David, I'm a little worried about the time. I would really like to hear from Joe, from the other David, and I can explain a bit more about what happened to this collection at that time. Okay.
Good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maureen. So, David, if you'd like to go.
Could
Yeah.
Joe unchair me? Thank you. Good.
Okay. You can see my image there. All right, very good. Wow, that was fantastic. Well, we've had a conversation before, Maureen, and there's a lot of overlap. Thank you so much, David, for inviting me here. I'm going to begin talking about a treaty acknowledgement first, actually. So I know you're all familiar with what treaty acknowledgements are. You know, they're important courtesies, but they're often rushed, and their weight and implications are blurred by recitation rather than resuscitation. And given the nature of our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to deepen our acknowledgement. So the numbered treaties, these are the treaties that rule the plains, are legal and sacred covenants between the Crown and the original inhabitants and stewards of the Great Plains and north central woodlands of the territory now known as Canada. The Crown is the legal name of the British government, whose rights in this matter were transferred to Canada's Crown at Confederation. According to British law, Canada's legal existence depended upon securing written settlements with the people who were here first. Treaty 4, signed in 1874, is an agreement between, on one side, settlers, their heirs, and anyone accepting the social contract of becoming a Canadian. And on the other side, the people then collectively known as Indians, which were the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota peoples. The spirit of the treaties is that in exchange for sharing their land, First Nations people are compensated, have reserved lands, and special rights in perpetuity. But elders understand that treaty is also with the Creator. It's a sacred obligation that includes our other than human relations. For Indigenous people, the idea of title to land and its surrender is inconceivable. Treaty is an agreement to share responsibility. And in this conversation, the notion of that extended field is really the topic that I'm going to engage. So I acknowledge that the territory that I'm on, Treaty 4, is, in addition to the treaty signatories, the area was shared at various times by Métis, that's the people that I belong to, the Blackfoot, and ancient others. So I'm a descendant of Laurent and Eleanor Garneau that came from Red River. In 1872, they left the Troubles. Laurent was involved with Louis Riel particularly, and when the invasion came from the east, they had to go. And so they settled in what is now called Edmonton in Treaty 6, where I grew up. And that's their lot number 7. The University of Alberta is right here and slowly encroaching on the Garneau land, but this neighborhood is still called Garneau. And this is the Hudson's Bay Fort right across. And then the Papa's Chase Reserve is just below it. I've got so many stories, but no time. So I'm going to talk a little bit of theory and then go into its opposite, a form of practice. And then in the conversation, I'd really like to come back and parse out some of these ideas, particularly around stones. I'm interested in exactly that moment that Maureen was talking about, where things that are this is true in English and in European thought, the notion of something being a rock, and then at what point it becomes a stone, and what kind of operation that is, and whether it's a human operation or inherent in the objects as well. So I understand sentience as not only a sensual apparatus, which is the property of a discrete being, but also as the whole sensual, affective, and extra-rational array shared among a variety of beings. That's dense, so let me try that again. So I understand sentience as not only a sensual apparatus, which is the property of a discrete being, so all my sense that's embodied in me, but also as the whole sensual, affective, and extra-rational array shared among a variety of beings, human and non-human. And personally, I'm specifically interested in sentience as relations between human and non-living beings, so not plants and animals. For instance, as an artist, I'm interested in how human beings coexist, communicate, even love, such things as statues, blocks of wood, paintings, but especially rocks and other non-cultural things. So sentience are extra-rational sensations felt by human beings, but also those which are projected by them onto and into non-living beings. That's sort of the rational explanation. So these projections give non-living beings a semblance of life that, through repeated visiting, and that's a key, and Maureen talked about that, the playing of the drum makes it sentient in that sense, or gives it feeling in relation, only and ever in relation to a human being. So through repeated visiting, eventually becomes so convincing that we cannot, at least in the realm of the extra rational experience, if not the realm of reason, we cannot deny them actual life, autonomy, and uncanny being. The thing is, these projections do not enliven just any or everything. They work best with objects with inherent properties that attract, even generate such sensations. So certain rocks become in relation to us, and other rocks are not in relation to us. And even those mere rocks can become stones through the act of relating. And in which case, can you say that what they have was something that attracted us, so it has its own quality, or is it just purely a projection? Clearly, there's a dialogue going on there. But particularly with works of art that are designed with the intent of attracting, but also they have a being, a personality, even a whole history, if you think of a character in a novel as a person. So regardless of their seeming sources, so regardless of whether you take the rational approach that these are projections, humans regard, live with, communicate, even love many seemingly inanimate things as if they were animated, had sentience, even metaphysical being apart from them and apart from the humans who are said to project on them. Okay, so I'm a skeptic. What does this mean in my personal life? I fell in hate with this object. 22 years ago, I moved to Regina from Calgary, from Alberta, and there are no statues of John A. Macdonald in Alberta. There's none in mainland Victoria. There was one about 5 years ago in Victoria, sorry, in BC. In Victoria, there was one, but they got rid of it when the Indigenous people had an affect of, were repelled by it. There's not one in Manitoba, just here where Riel was hung under the orders, so to speak, of John A. Macdonald. So when I'm trying to figure out what this city's like, I walk around, I go to Victoria Park, and there's a statue, and I just had a visceral response. He ought not be there. He shouldn't be in this space that Riel should have a greater claim on, perhaps, or something. I don't know. I wasn't even thinking. That's the important thing. It was a visceral response. So what did I do? I stayed away. I was gloomy. And then every anniversary of Riel's execution, I would do something. So I'd go to the space. I would lay, first of all, a big noose, and later on little tiny nooses. And later I met a groundskeeper who was the one in charge of this space and was removing them, which I thought was pretty funny. And then eventually about 7 years ago, I was invited to do a performance, and I had it all in my head what I was going to do. So this private action became a public performance. Oh, and before that, I would go to Walmart. You could get a little toy here of John A. Macdonald, and I would pry out the back and put in a little noose and then put it back on the shelf. So that was another private action. I'm gonna race through some of these artworks because there's just so much, and I want to give you a sense, a feeling about relations to objects rather than tell you all about my artwork. But here I am dressed as Louis Riel addressing the statue. And what ends up happening in this relationship is, as Riel, who's a non-living person, his ghost. What kind of being is that? I realized that I'm posturing like John A. I'm petitioning him at first. I'm posturing. I'm trying to, he's holding a scroll. I'm holding a scroll. I'm trying to get some communication going and realizing he really doesn't care. But also, why am I wanting to be like him? Why am I putting myself in relation? So I turn my back on him. I build a little sweat lodge and take off my sort of 150-year-old version of Métis and enter a contemporary form of indigeneity with my adult Moore shirt. But I do a little smudge in my lodge and then I pack up and go. Well, it was so relieving. I was able to put this character behind me in that site, but then I found out they have other statues. So I did a similar ceremony. Oh, each one, there were more to it. There were drummers as well. And this is at the statue in Kingston. And then I also went to Ottawa and did a similar performance during Canada 150. Later on in the summertime, I had 2 suits made, the summer suit and the winter suit. I posted this on Facebook, and when I did my performance there, I wasn't going to spray paint him, but an awful lot of police showed up just in case I might. Here's some other objects I made. Here they are. These are dice that you roll, and if you roll them, you might say, I am fairly sorry. I am so sorry. I'm tired of this. We are tired of this. They are tired of this. And you roll it as a conversation starter. And I did this in the Shinwalk Residential School. And this is with elders on the left-hand side. And they only rolled it once. That's all they needed to start talking. And they were divided among themselves whether to take the apology seriously. But the woman down in the bottom here, and I'm sorry, I don't remember their names. This was about 8 years ago. She was picking up the die and said how light they were. And she said, but they will get heavier the more you use them. And so what was initially an artwork suddenly became a living being, for me anyways, and for the participants. The woman on the right was rolling the story in honor of her uncle who had died fleeing the residential school. And so she gets us all hyped up. It's a religious group. I think they were Anglicans. And she says, this is in honor of my uncle. She rolls it and the dice lands on its edge, which is impossible. I've rolled this 1,000 times and I can't make it land on its edge. So certainly the religious folks there were quite terrified of Indigenous voodoo or whatever's going on. I curated with Michelle Lavallee an exhibition called Moving Forward, Never Forgetting, about Indian residential schools and reconciliation among Indigenous people rather than conciliation among Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And this was an interesting case. He took the bedstead, this is Adrian Stipson, took the bedstead from the actual Old Sun Indian residential school that was near his neighborhood where his dad actually worked. And elders knew what it was right away and refused to go into this space. Not everybody, but many of them, the survivors. But the object resonated with, you can't even call it meaning. Maybe affect is a stronger word, perhaps not, but an uncanny sense of being where something familiar has way more loaded into it. And certainly the kind of bison mummy that Adrian puts there has that effect. And I just want to show other examples of how Indigenous folks do this. Over on the left-hand side, you see it's David Benjo's work. And he was a student of mine. And after completing this project, he actually died. But he was trying to contend with his Indian residential school and his fathers and uncles. So we decided that we needed some kind of object because it wasn't doing to have us talking face to face or talking to other people. We needed an intermediary. So he came up with this object. It's a 21-foot scroll, which has the story of his life painted on it relatively crudely. His father was so enamored of how the thing worked, I don't have time to talk about it, that he made his own scroll. And actually you can see in the previous thing, when we had the opening, the father said, how come my scroll's not here? And so we opened up the cabinet and put it in. Little by little, the things revealed. But when he went to the TRC, the father, David Benjo's dad, refused to open the object to make it legible. Its presence as this being was, he said, made it possible for him to approach the TRC with his experience, but that they weren't entitled to a greater unveiling of the being. To me, that's really a perfect description of a ceremonial object and its different states of being depending on its relationship. This is another interesting object, Leah Decter, and oh shoot, I can't read the name there, I forgot. But this is Trade Value in Progress out of Winnipeg, where they took these blankets and people wrote their comments on Stephen Harper's claim that Canada doesn't have a history of colonialism. And when it was in the exhibition, we actually understood it as a being, and it could leave when it needed to. And so here are people adding more to it in our exhibition space, but not in the gallery space. We had a separate room built with Dylan Miner had it, so we could bring in the other senses of touch, of smells. There's an array of medicines on the wall beside us, and tea was served. Here it is traveling over to First Nations University, and it also went to one of the reserves. In fact, many of the objects in the exhibition left, came back, or were made somewhere else and came in during the show. Here's Peter Morin's work. Peter Morin asked people to bring in books that were had racist content, and he wanted to, well, what he did is in ceremony in the gallery, he washed with a group of 6 other people every single page of these books in a medicinal tea. And his notion is he wanted to honor the labor that people, rightly or wrongly, in terms of content, he wanted to honor the labor they put in. And then he also wanted to honor the books as once were trees. And then after the exhibition, he buried them in various places across Canada. Oh, here's Dylan Miner's tea room. So here's the tea on the other side and a mural with the medicines and so on. But it was a really interesting way of dealing with the space and bringing this whole sensual array and relationships. And rather than just having the objects abandoned to be discreet and separate from people, we hired 3 Indigenous story keepers, we call them, who were with them at every time. And so anytime somebody had a question, they would be there physically with the beings. So finally, I want to talk about this piece, which is why I'm supposed to be here. And I should have been talking for 20 minutes, but I really felt the need to contextualize it. So this is Heartband, an object that I've produced with Garnet Willis, a PhD student in Concordia, and he did all the hard work. I came up with the idea, painted the drums, but he came up with these arrays here so that as you approach this structure, a heartbeat sounds, it's my heartbeat, and the closer you get, the faster it beats and the louder it beats. And I understood it as being an instrument that you would play without touching it. And here's the electric eye. I won't describe all the pieces, but there's all sorts of meaningful objects. I happened that summer to, before I painted them, go into I guess I'd call it a teaching camp or a combination of that and ceremony for 4 days and 4 nights, learning a little bit about the Cree origin story for other work that I was doing with Jerry Saddleback in Edmonton, which is my home community. And so some of them, so that's a Métis flag, Métis beading. Some of them, yeah, some of them I don't want to explain, but they're also in relation to each other. This one's easy to understand. This is Batoche. It's the river lots when they're meeting the grid that Canada posed in 1867 that caused the resistance in Red River and at Batoche. This is an Idle No More piece. Yeah, anyways, but the important thing is the way it's played. So we invited Zab Babungu to play it. Unfortunately, it was during COVID, and so I was over there disembodied by computer, but David Howes was there in person with some of the rest of our crew. And it was just extraordinary. I'll open up a little bit more about what happened there. But she was not happy with it because she couldn't touch it, and drums are meant to be touched, skin to skin contact. And that's the irony of that. There's a hand thing here. I knew that in advance. That would be trouble, not just with her, but for others. And but she did. She found a way to co-respond. I think of co-responding, not just responding, but co-responding. So I'm trying to illustrate for non-believers the animacy of this thing through electronic means. But I want them to understand that that's just an illustration. The real thing is a co-respondence, a writing back and forth to each other. And she did, she moved her body in a way that was quite stiff originally. So outside of her normal discursive way with her body, that responded to the sort of analytic proposal of the object, and then found a space and a rhythm in between those two tendencies. And that to me is an important sense of this co-respondence, or this relationship between two kinds of beings. Anyways, I also do still life painting and so on that take up this same subject. And if there's time later, I might discuss it, but how about I leave it here?
Thank you ever so much, David and Maureen. And what I would like to ask is that maybe we can go into the screen as a whole, the gallery, and this idea of in relationship comes up repeatedly in both of your talks. And so, animacy can only be understood in relationship. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because, if I can say this, things move of their own accord or they don't. And, some things that may be inanimate can move, like a steam engine, for example, because of certain kinds of force. But David, your point was that those drums, yes, you gave them electricity, yes, you gave them power to act, but it's this idea of relationship and correspondence that's really so. This adds another dimension to our understanding of sentience as an on-off switch. Could you two please elaborate on that somewhat?
Yeah, so first of all, the sentience is not only the properties of a discrete body, but it's in the relationship. So if you imagine those rocks in the field, two rocks separate from each other and not in relation, they don't even know each other. And they move, glaciation, they move because of forces we don't understand why they move, but also they move because people pick them up and move them. And we don't want to separate any of those actions from any of the other ones, because it's that movement in relation to other bodies. That's the only way we can understand them. I'm totally fascinated how people respond to physical objects and need to have them around. I've got rocks around me all the time. I've got these, I just love these rocks that are found throughout the prairies. And I hold them and I can get a sense of how they were used in the past. And theoretically, I can know one way, but when I physically relate to them, I understand them. And at that moment of touch of picking them up, they become in relationship to me. And then you can say from a logical point of view that you're projecting that meaning, but in actually physically touching them, nothing rational or logical is happening. I actually feel the relationship. And so the object is giving me that relation. Now I can say that it's all projection. I can say that, but I know it otherwise. And so I want to talk for very briefly, just to add the notion of intuition. So intuition from a logocentric point of view always favors the idea of an idea in the sense of a vision or a set of words. But intuitions cannot be known outside of their manifestation. And apart from words and vision, they also come as bodily sensation, a feeling wrong, a feeling right, all kinds of things. And so I'm interested in how those relations are in relation outside of the language. It's so profound. And it's not hard to convince someone that objects in a museum have that quality. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. We keep and save these things and keep them in relation, or keep them apart and almost in confinement, because we understand their sentience, and that their sentience becomes alive, knowable or recognized when in relation with us. Anyways, I'm rambling.
Not rambling at all. It's that idea of in relation. And an interesting sort of observation as well. Objects in museums, okay, are there because they have something. And you were talking about this power. I think of a book like What Pictures Want by W.J.T. Mitchell. And okay, so there's a book about attributing and projecting. I think it would be appropriate to speak of projecting here. Certain intentions onto paintings, not their authors, but the paintings themselves. And what you are saying, and I want to just come to Maureen in a minute, is that projection doesn't do it, okay? Because projection, it's too easy an explanation, and it is only actually it doesn't account for the relationship, which is when you hold something. But of course, in a museum, if you can never hold anything, then it just remains a projection. So what is that element of holding for you?
But that's part of its power. So it is not an Indigenous idea to incarcerate objects, right? So in the colonial project, these objects need to be incarcerated. I don't want to dismiss this altogether, because there are a lot of Indigenous people who are happy with they wouldn't think of it as incarceration, but as in shared keeping, so I can go and visit at any time those, what's his name, Jordan Wilson calls belongings. They have a belonging. So then again, emphasizing the relationship rather than artifacts or something else. But it's in the holding that we're restrained from doing so because of their very power, right? I mean, there's a fear of contamination. Think of all the things: contamination, disintegration. So that kind of curation as curing, as in freeze drying or controlling, is so anathema to Indigenous. I don't want to go on too much, but certainly I know Maureen understands this concept. The notion of, say, a drum, I'm really interested in the artifact as being different from the found object in nature, but the drum has intention, right? It comes from a body that made it, and which belongs to a whole chain of bodies that it learned from. And the drum itself is an iteration of many drums in the past. And all those, both the bodies of the maker and the craftsperson and the drum, has a future trajectory. And so this drum is just one instance. So when the drum's destroyed, you just make another one. It's still the drum, the same drum. And so that's a very different notion. So the idea of breaking that chain and incarcerating the one object and fetishizing that can seem kind of strange. But in this disrupted moment where Indigenous knowledge has been lost, a lot of Indigenous people are so happy that at least these things are rescued and they can recreate those bodies again. I'm quite astonished by that sort of new relationship with museums and with anthropology. But it's also a melancholic one.
And on that point, Maureen Matthews's drum was returned to the wrong community. And so the relations didn't line up. And this really speaks to this idea of relationship. And so part of your work was with the people that you knew to work out where it should be repatriated. And so what is it when it's the wrong relations that an object is inserted into?
Well, I should just explain that, can you hear me all right? Yeah, that when Omashush visited the objects that he had formerly used as a ceremonial way at the museum, it was very interesting because he had no word for museum. He called it a school. That, which is correct. It was at a university museum. He had known that these objects had been retired. he said of them that they had done their work in life, that they had a role as educators, but that they mustn't ever be used in ceremony again, that they had been retired. And he had obviously the whole Anishinaabe vocabulary around that. And he warned against trying to use them again. And then he observed about the gallery, the area where these objects were stored. He sort of thought of it as like the perfect retirement home for these objects. They had been placed in the bush and would probably have eventually rotted. And he said, here they are. He talks about them being aesthetically preserved. And he commended the institution for preserving them. And he said, now these objects will be able to teach, because they still have the capacity to do that. They will be used to teach the young people what those old people could really do. And he provided for this institution an absolutely fabulous mandate of education. And it's a mandate that the communities still understand. What happened after that was that, in spite of him clearly knowing what these objects were, of him having personally, used some of them and so on, the curator of the museum at the time was really seized with the idea that you just expressed about these objects being incarcerated, and felt that it was important for them to be released, and it didn't matter to whom, and gave them to a group based in Wisconsin. And so that group, there are 240 objects in the collection. They took about 40 of them, including this particular drum, and that belonged to the water drum I showed you. And it was done secretly, didn't find out for a year and a half. And so it wasn't a normal repatriation in any sense. Nobody was notified. The community from whom it came was never told. And the people who got the drum never made it public either. So it was a secret thing. And so in every sense, it's not a proper repatriation. And then undoing this took 18 years. The community knew right from the beginning. The old man, before he died, he said, if it's not yours and you take it, it's gimode, it's theft. And so he understood that these objects had been taken, but in the course of talking about it, because all this conversation was happening in Ojibwe, what he was saying about the object was really like to trust the object. It'll, things will work out. The people in Pauingassi never made any kind of move to retrieve the objects that had been taken. The person who did that was me as a journalist, thinking, oh, this is an outrage. I should do something about this. I'm going to visit these people and talk to them about it, which I did. And one of the old ladies in the community, she said, this is where she talked about me as an inanimate person. As she understood it, that drum was the Wikanak of Namawin. And when Namawin died, like some people, when they die, they have the capacity to move back and forth between the land of the dead, and their presence is still around. So what she said about Omashush when he passed away in the middle of all this, oh, those people in Wisconsin better look out, because that old man is freed from his body now. And you can even tell the way people talk about them, because both Namawan and Omashush, so if I die, I will be Maureen Iban, the late Maureen, but they never add that Iban to those two guys, because the assumption is that they are not bound by the rules that apply to the rest of us, and their ritual relatives, the drum, for instance, can still act in the world with them, even though they've passed away. So they talked to me about me and what I did to go to Wisconsin and talk to these folks, and to explain the Pauingassi point of view, as me acting like as an inanimate entity directed by this other power. So it was their conviction that the drum would be okay, that in a sense allowed them to just wait for things to turn out, which they did. So I do see what you mean about the museum objects, and there are many objects that have been cut off from their community, and it's that disruption of the relationship which is so tragic. But there is also, like in this particular instance, no disruption of the understanding of the role those objects can play, or their potentiality and their capacity to carry on having force. And so in a way, the story of this repatriation, if you take the people out of it, and if you think about it as, a very powerful drum sitting on a shelf thinking, this is boring, what can I do to stir things up and make myself famous? Really, you couldn't come up with a better storyline. And if you can, in your imagination, achieve an understanding of the story in that way, it helps you to understand Anishinaabe perspective on these objects and their potentiality, which never leaves, although they're allowed to retire, and how people could be so content, amused, interested, and in an object, and how they sort of in the community sense retain that relationship in spite of everything. I don't know if I've answered your question, David, but maybe you could.
Well, actually, you have. But let me just ask one follow-up question, and I must stop being so immoderate and moderate instead, and give the floor to other people. But I'll get to that in a moment. But you were inanimate insofar as you were fulfilling the will, if I can call it that, of the drum to shake things up. So when you, this goes back to that idea that rocks move. Why do they move? Well, because of glaciation or other things, humans and so forth. But that's just a given. But the point here, I'm trying to get at and understand, is that you acting in your capacity as a journalist, wanting to get to the bottom of this story, wanting to get things sorted, were referred to as an inanimate being because you were, in a way, carrying out the mission of the drum, or is that the right way to think about it?
Well, I guess I can't go back to my slide, but I did have a slide that sort of explained this. There's we have these absolute categories: alive, not alive. The Anishinaabe point of view and the Anishinaabe vocabulary allows you to look at it in a much more nuanced way. So, as a person, I have life. B'matsid, I think, is the way you say it, there is a plan for my life, and X number of kids are expected, and I will follow through the expectations of my life that is a normal person, and I have no capacity to magically change that, and I hope that nobody else will magically change my prospects. There are people who have more capacity, they're said to be able to bring life into something. So a medicine man can give you life, and that source of life is thunderbirds. And so the medicine man kind of has life as like a commodity almost to give you more. And when you get treated, not for like a cold or something, but for when suddenly your life is not going as it ought to, you're kind of a fate interference where you think somebody else is interfering, a medicine man can intervene and give you more life, and restore your capacity to be just a person in the world. And so but the other thing is that medicine men don't act alone. So, for instance, there's Umashush. His example was a story of how his grandfather saved his life once. He had had a terrible abscess. He realized he had died. He was walking along this beautiful path to the land of the dead, which is typical, and he heard a song, and he heard somebody calling his name, and he turned around on that path to the land of the dead, and he returned, and he had a moment of seeing himself lying in a lodge, and then the next minute he knew he was in his body, but he realized he died because his aunties were all crying all around him. And the way he explained it, he said, what my grandfather did was he used his drum and his rattle to become a Wolverine. And as a Wolverine, he had the power to go toward the land of the dead and make the return trip. And so it wasn't just the grandfather, it was the drum and the rattle and the grandfather acting to be able to do a magical thing, which is, like most people, the land road to the land of the dead is a one-way trip. And so one time we were talking about this old man in one of the communities, and these two old guys were in front of us. Roger was with me, and they were saying, you know, that old man, he used to brag that he could go to the land of the dead and bring back a flower. And the other guy said, I wonder if he ever did. And so this is the sort of intellectual environment in which this is happening. You know, I too have rocks, David, and mine are little, the kind of rocks that a Miigwechsawak chew, and you can see their tooth marks on it. And they are part of a world of thinking about things where Miigwechsawak are the ones who look after the stones, where they are the ones who beautify the cliffs where they live. And they're the ones who taught everybody how to make stone tools. So one of the problems we have with explanations of animacy is that we don't credit people with the explanations of how these things come about and the range of relationships that are involved in these objects doing things. I feel like I'm going on, but I'd really love to hear what David was thinking about that.
I just want to add a nuance. I just love this because normally in certain kinds of circles, and especially Indigenous circles, non-traditional folks have a knee-jerk reaction, get all the stuff repatriated, but they have such a range of quality of being. 3 years ago, I was in Norway and we were touring with the Sami, and one of the people I was with is a mid-career curator, Kimberly Mouton, who's a Yorta Yorta woman from Australia, working in Melbourne at the time. And she told me the story of going to Germany and seeing some of the Yorta Yorta objects that they had in one of the museums there and feeling very sad, going back to her elders, explaining how she was sad that they're there. As a museum person, should they try and repatriate them? And he says, but those are our ambassadors. And the idea again is that they had a will to be another place than where they were. And the elder then said, and it's their being in that other location that allowed you to go and visit them. And the idea that again, like you, not only is the object mobile, but it creates a mobility for the other people, and they want to see the world. And I think that just that the nuance and range, and it requires the special knowers and seers to identify these objects and their meanings. And sometimes I remember talking to folks at the Glenbow in Calgary, where there were some objects, you know, the Stony, the Blackfoot, whoever, they didn't want those back because they didn't know what they were. And they could have been bad gifts given away. So that nuance is so important. And it goes back to all these relations. You have to negotiate, renegotiate. You can't assume, you know. And so, yeah, to me, I just love all the nuance of the story. And this also fits for contemporary art. You know, a lot of Indigenous people aren't aware how they are vessels. You know, they're not just making self-expressions, they're making something that has meaning for community, and or not community of the present necessarily, but of the future. And so how are those going to be negotiated? It's just also interesting to me.
And David, you mentioned how there are series. Like this drum before us now is an iteration or a reiteration of a whole series of prior drums. And the relationship between those drums is a genealogical one. How is that understood?
So I'm talking about only how I was taught it. So been a few elders I've talked to about this, Sykes Powderface, who's Stony Lakota, and Jerry Saddlebacks. I sort of presented that to him and asked if that made sense from a Cree point of view. And yeah, they're in accord. And the notion is almost a Platonic sense of the drum that has its reiterations, but there's also a sense though that there's not a pure form of the drum. It's not remote necessarily. Yeah, But the most important thing is the relationship between the drum and the maker, the drum and the player. You know, they're not separable. And so it does a little violence to separate them. And not, like you say, Maureen says, you know, some will be retired. Just think of totem poles. And a totem pole, say a shaming pole, it's got a certain life. And as long as the shames are required. And then when that reconciliation is made, then the pole comes down. And if it's not made, the reconciliation is not made, then a new pole replaces the one that's rotted. And so this is the notion that I take really seriously, is the requirement of visiting. You know, so I'm interested in the John A. Macdonald statue because it's made permanent and it still has an existence, even though if it's not visited. You know, and so we're in negotiations with the city right now. I'm happy to say they took out that statue, and now we're working with not we working, but there's a proposal in it which I hope to be part of, which is about how would we replace that. And for me, it should be a site that requires visiting to keep it alive, whether it's a medicine garden or, you know, a performance festival around that site or whatever it is. So I'm interested in these alternative notions of what constitutes an Indigenous public artwork, particularly in the sense of a memorial that's not imposing itself on the future in terms of making itself out of metal, but something less permanent that has to be renewed each time. So that's that kind of relationship, not only of the moment, but the relationship in the future that's implied by the drum that's renewing itself, but also the maker that's renewing it. And that's the thing. I just was my heart so heartened by Maureen's presentation and seeing those images, because that's what's occurring there too. Whereas in other places on the plains, there's been such a dramatic disruption. So I've been working on a few projects in Edmonton, and I'm a Métis person. And I was asked by the elders to do this work because there wasn't a Cree person who had knowledge. Certain crafts, for instance, were lost, and he had the meanings, but not the ability to represent them. And so that's an interesting new task as an artist. And so I'm no longer, at least in these projects, making works of self-expression that is the Western, primarily Western, modernist, not historical sense of what the artist does, but something that is between myself and those people who are guiding me. And I don't think of myself as inanimate, but I'm going to think about that because I've described myself as a tool, but I know I'm not a mere tool. I'm extended. I'm still part of this other consciousness.
This is, and you know, for you as an artist, sort of to allow that you're not in control, that you are not the visionary genius. I mean, that's humbling, and so you know this is important. There are two questions, one of which I'm just going to foreground. This is from Gabrielle, who is a curator too. And she wonders about how she can envision as ambassadors a corpus of African art pieces that ended up in their museum in Quebec, unnoticed, you know, and not really exhibited. But the idea is very interesting. You know, they've begun to co-document the piece and envision repatriation, where these objects could be better shared and used. But you know, any advice? This is a real disruption. Those relationships have been definitively severed. What would you say, Maureen or David? You know, in this context, David, you're.
Maybe
Sorry,
I could just
Maureen.
start, but yeah, as a museum person, this is the sort of everyday dilemma of objects that have become detached from their histories. And I just warn you not to presume that the objects are keen on this, or that a community can be established which will create a bona fide relationship. And I think that is, like, we have pipes on exhibit in our museum. And they are there as part of an exhibit which does the same thing as David's introduction. It's the name of the exhibit is "You Are on Treaty Land," as every medal for every treaty in Manitoba, and every medal is matched with a pipe. The elders required that, but to have a pipe on exhibit, I talk about them as ambassadors, but it is because they have a bona fide relationship with the community. They are celebrated once a year. The ceremony to get them into the museum, which is by no means a conventional thing, was very well thought out. They leave the museum every year for ceremony. They are called upon to participate in anniversary events for treaties, and it takes, you can't just assume they're ambassadors because they're out of the country. You have an ambassadorship is a representational relationship, and it has to, I would say, don't presume it has to be real.
Yeah, I agree. When I was muted, I was saying so eloquently that I'm going to turn it over to Maureen, who has to deal with on the daily basis. There's a concept that I use myself of, I call it respectful trying. And that is, the notion of the essay is to try, or to trial. And I've seen a number of events. So the Reme recently, I forgot the new, Michelle Jakes is there, and she put up a show where she brought up these objects and said, we don't know. This might be a ceremonial object. It's likely to be a tourist object. What is its status? What does it mean? And sometimes I think the reason why it's good to bring some of these things up that are not so well contained by language and display and knowledge is that there might be someone who resonates with the object in the general public. African folks might come in and diasporic folks and recognize something. This happened beautifully in an exhibition Timothy Long put together at the Mackenzie here, which was called I think it was called A Tale of Two Valleys, something like that, sort of an indigenous version of the Capel Valley and the settler version. And there were many photographs in which family members were coming in. They didn't know the names, and they were saying, well, that's so-and-so, that's this, and making these connections. And so they had a better relationship with the gallery as a result. But the presumption that people in the museum know all these objects that were collected by people in the past and didn't pass on all of the knowledge except for these little cards, ethnographic, So I think that respectful trying is, and showing yourself as not being definitive is really essential. And it creates that wider field of knowledge and expertise.
But the curator is the expert, is the connoisseur, and has arrogated all of those qualities to themselves. Not the ones we're with today, but that's precisely it. So Gabrielle, a challenging prospect, and this idea of things as ambassadors, I find deeply compelling, and really, an appropriate language finally to talk in terms of. I just wonder, do any of these objects, say, look, I'm retired. Okay? I don't want to be performing anymore. And I'm sure there's ways of signaling that as well, like not being found when you go to find them or try to find them, in the storeroom, and so forth. But this just makes the storeroom of the museum, which is where most things end up. They don't end up on display. And David, you have some very compelling images. I don't know if you are able to share any of those with you of grandfather. If could you? I love these. Could you just, if you have it handy, grandfather archived and grandfather contemplating Western ocular centrism. I just love to be able to share this with our audience if it's possible. If it's not, then so be it.
Yeah, I can find it here.
Okay, and while you're looking, okay,
yeah.
This is another sort of cross-cultural question, which I think is really interesting. Maureen and David, you've immersed us in an understanding of a particular set of relations that is very powerful. Okay, well, here, okay. The title of this piece is, Grandfather Contemplating Western Ocular Centrism. And so, you have not a rock, but a stone in front of a mirror. and what kind of reflection is going on. This image just completely captivated my imagination when I saw it. It's an acrylic oil painting. And then, David, the next one.
Yeah, let me
okay.
let me add, I normally don't talk about them. I've been trying to create works that I don't talk about, and I can't help myself. So I'm interested in that passage when a stone becomes a rock becomes a stone. And different language speakers have told me that it's the same, in Blackfoot Cree, the notion of something being itself in its own place is a stone, is a rock. But as soon as it's apprehended, even by the imagination, but especially by the use, it becomes a stone. And then in the famous Manitou stone that was geologists would say it was a meteorite, that has yet another level of being that's separate. And when it's then used and touched by people, what is that special relation? I just love that. But also the problem too comes when the rock becomes a stone, it becomes pictured, right? It becomes it enters that sort of Foucaultian picture space, ideal space, rather than its real sight. So what is it when it's looking at itself? And of course, that's true of us too. The grandfather archived, again, I hope there's ambiguousness in everything that I do, because it's exactly what Maureen's been saying. There are some things that have been incarcerated, but other ones that have been kept. And so the notion of moving towards thinking of the museum as a keeping house in which these relations are always renegotiated is essential. And then it's renegotiated again by visiting. I've got another one to get. Oh yeah. So here's so for most of these, the rock is indigenous being or indigenous person or a rock or stone. And then the book is trying to capture that knowledge. And in this case, this is an honorarium that, some elders don't want to get paid and some of them do. It's just this horrible situation that people are sandwiched between. There's lots. This one was Canadian art being shaped by Indigenous art. And of course, now that magazine is folded, it's got another set of meanings. Anyways, I'll stop share.
Thank you ever so much. This is part of a whole series, and David has another series, Dark Chapters, which I actually have been invited by the curator of the series to comment on one of the pieces, and I can't wait to do so. But my brain is going to be hurting a lot as I try, to do justice to these relationships. So another question for you, from outside. Emily talks about her research concerning dolls, and she's finding that technology is making it more socially acceptable to fall in love with statues and dolls and robots. Do you both think it's important to have more acceptance or adoption of a worldview wherein objects have animus, as opposed to perhaps the spooky, eerie, uncanny negative view? And in particular, we're talking about those dolls that are so lifelike that they are indeed uncanny. They are just too human, ever too human, that Emily has been exploring. So what would you say?
Maureen, do you want to go first?
Okay. I think that there's a problem in her question. There is an assumption that giving animacy to objects is a kind of magical thinking of Indigenous people. And as David pointed out, we wouldn't have museums if we didn't believe that objects tell stories, that culture inheres in them, and that being in the presence of the real thing matters. But human beings also are, there is a sort of a willingness to allow things to be animate that seems to be unrelated to how much they look like a person. And in fact, there's research on how people resist the idea of being fooled. So the closer a thing gets to looking like a person, the less they're likely to credit it with being real. And so I think that you should think about that with respect to these dolls. And also dolls, as with anything, take on meaning because of the gift, who gave them, their story, their material context. And don't look for one meaning, look for many.
Yeah, I agree with the question in the sense that, you know, the uncanny is tied to Freud and the Gothic imaginary for sure, late 19th century spiritualism and all of that. But there's also that sense, just, I like moving things from one category to another, and look at how many people take fictional characters seriously and have deep relationships with fictional characters. Petra von Morstein, philosopher, now passed, really convinced me of that. You know, you tell me Hamlet's not a real person who keeps getting reincarnated. You know, that's part of the Western imagination, or any of the figures in the Bible or whatever. So these fictions or deceased people clearly capture our imagination in troubling ways in the Gothic sense, but also in intimate ways. I totally agree with Maureen too, that these projections are, yes, passed on to things that are, it's actually, there's a cartoonist, oh shoot, I've forgotten his name now, who shows you, you know, if you put a circle with just 2 dots and a little smile, that attracts much more imagination from people than a fully rendered figure. And you can get all kinds of projections and meanings and associations out of it. I think there's something very important about those robots and dolls, and certainly the notion of more than human relations that might be coming, you know, therapy dogs, robots, and how people are quite willing to project on them. But I totally agree with Maureen that if we're less concerned about realism and more about other forms of attraction, and David might pipe in here with what do they smell like? What is their texture? I think those kinds of things might be more important. And all you have to look at those old horrible experiments with the monkeys who were trained on the cage mother with the bottle and the warm mother, you know, and there's all these other things that are more important than realism.
This idea, you know, putting realism in its place is really an interesting one. And, you know, it's sort of a relationalism that you are constructing in opposition to that. But I think that, you know, when we talk about relations sometimes in the social sciences, they're just a network, right? And I really don't feel as though it's just a network that you're talking about. You know, it's more like a spider's web or something that is living. And so, you know, if this, okay, like I think we understand that the importance of relations here, you know, relations over things, and relations over will, or relations over, you know, agency in the limited sense of being self-moving. But then what word? I mean, you've given us the word ambassador, which has been a wonderful word, you know, for us to reflect with. But what is the word for these relations? I don't want to say. Okay.
Go ahead, Maureen.
Can I start? Okay, so I, as I said, I started off not as an anthropologist, but as a friend of these people in Pauingassi, and I found in anthropology finally somebody who I could talk about. I even talked with her, Marilyn Strathern, and she talks about distributed personhood. And so the distributed personhood idea takes away from the individual the notion of controlling their impact in the world, or even controlling their relationships, and it allows for the person's affect to be distributed. And when I applied that to objects with her permission, to talk about the object as a distributed person, it worked wonderfully because it allowed for the object to have multiple histories, as people do. It allowed for a meaning to be submerged and then emerge again later on. It allowed for new relationships. And that was especially powerful for me as a museum curator, because I mentioned these pipes that are now in the museum acting as ambassadors for Indigenous people. Those pipes are the same pipes that had no provenance. Their history was effectively cut off from the museum point of view by lack of information, but they still had the capacity to form new relationships, and they now have very profound relationships, and they are honored as actors for Indigenous people, they have a new life. And so that idea of distributed person allowed me to think that you know, it isn't an end game. The museum certainly isn't an end game, and there's lots of possibility within the museum. If you introduce more relationships and introduce new relationships, these objects are fully capable of that, as any person who moves to a new place or, you know, gets out of containment of some sort, they can form new relationships. So, and material objects also are used to confirm relationships. And so, you know, the idea of talking about pipes as ambassadors is very profoundly within Anishinaabe practice. There's loads of historical accounts of Peguis giving a pipe to somebody who's going to England and saying, this pipe is coming with you, and it's to address this particular concern, and please, you know, and talking about the pipe as an ambassador and having it return, saying this pipe is my, you know, my argument for this, or my person who's going with you. So I like that idea of ambassadorship because it is also respectful of Anishinaabe ways of thinking.
And I think not settling on a single word is important. The kind of nuance we've been talking about for different qualities of different objects, but especially of different relations. That gifted object, the object that is gifted to a witness, for instance, as a way of securing physically that relationship and obligation, that you are a pipe carrier, literally. I mean, there's so many things. In the kind of European sense, and especially in the contemporary sense, I'm fond of the word art, because it can't be defined. And every time someone tries to bottle it, it escapes. And literally there's no definition. It's the most uncanny thing of all. And so we get to use it as we see fit. And the reason why I like art is the notion of the creation of a non-traditional object. It might be based in a tradition, but that it has to expand to take in a new situation. So David Bendro's scrolls were based on teepee liners, but he needed more room. And those teepee liners, so what happened is during battles and wars, guys would go out, they'd have post-traumatic stress, and they'd come home and they'd paint their stories, but they show them to their fellow combatants. And so if they were bullshitting, they might be corrected or whatever, but they got to share their stories. But because they were images, they could decide to talk about whatever level they wanted. Just like when I was talking about that painting to you, I can tell you about one level or another, or not show you the whole scroll. And because it was in the teepee, it was around them all the time. And so after the Vietnam War, there were artists who were then told that they were sick, and their elder said, you have to do this new thing. And so all these Indigenous, David Bendro and his masters was realizing that his people are sick, himself included. And so this was a means. And the special thing about these art objects is, so they are traditional, but they're not held by tradition and not held by all the protocols. But also they're a thing between, right? The thing he made, but it's not himself. And it's something that can be shared partially, and that it has a life of its own. David died right after finishing it, and now it has a new life. He's told that story to numerous people. They can revive it, and some things will be lost. To me, that agency of the object in relation is hard to explain. I wouldn't want a word. I'd want a word like art. I wouldn't want a word that would try to contain it. And that's part of the thing I think, David, you were alluding at earlier, is that we use these as a method of understanding. We break them up. And what I've come to, certainly in the last 10 years profoundly, is finding how they're related to understand what they are, rather than to separate and to find out their unique qualities. And it's really caused me to make things and think of things differently.
David and Maureen, thank you ever so much for spending this time with us this afternoon. It's been a source of many revelations and new words and ideas like objects in relation, and really has expanded our universe, and really made an important contribution to this question of sentience that we're struggling with and that we've been approaching from different angles. And so this enriches that discussion immeasurably. And before I say goodbye, I just need to make two announcements, if I may. One is that the talk scheduled for the 12th of November, called Sensing Sentient Lands by Natasha Myers, has had to be canceled, but we look forward to rescheduling in the new year. And the talk by Chris Salter, called Sensing Machines, for the 19th of November, has been moved from 11 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, so those are just two small changes. The Jennifer Gabris talk on the 2nd of December remains as is, no changes there. So David and Maureen, thank you for this conversation this afternoon. And we look forward very much to following your work going forward. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Goodbye from Treaty 1 territory.
Thanks, Maureen. Thank you from Treaty 4. Bye.
Bye.